The next annotation I want to show you is required. Required is also part of the original assembly system component model.data annotations, not inside of the entity framework.dll assembly. So required does what you would expect it to do, which is to tell code first that whatever property it's set on is a required property. So let's take a look at how this impacts the database and also our application. That obviously all worked out because here we are again in the MVC application. And let's take a look at what happened in the database. The first thing to point out is the name property in the aliases table is now non-nullable. Now I want to point out that since I am using MVC, the required property is actually recognized by MVC. And by default, MVC does client-side validation. So if I leave that property empty, MVC is going to notice before Entity Framework does. So let's go ahead and create a new blog. In this case, I'm going to leave name empty because that's the one that's required. I'll just create another account for myself. And when I hit the Create button, MVC will alert me that the name field is required and I haven't filled it out. So I can't go ahead and save this Twitter alias. However, there's one more thing I want to show you about this. First, I want to put a breakpoint here on the create, and I want to show you the difference between the client-side validation and Entity Framework doing server-side validation. I'll go ahead and try to save this again. I'll make a little change, and I'll click Create, and I'm still getting the problem the name field is required. But what didn't happen was I never even got to my breakpoint, right? That's because MVC was detecting the problem. So I'm going to make a little change here and turn off the client-side validation in MVC. In web config for an MVC application created from the project template, client-side validation is enabled. So I'll go ahead and disable it. So remember last time I didn't even get to the controller action because the validation was done on the client side, so I never hit this breakpoint. So let me do it again with the client-side validation disabled. I'll go ahead and click Create, and now I've gotten to the controller. So the client-side validation did not recognize that problem because I turned it off. But on the server side, with this default code that was generated by MVC, I'm still getting MVC to read that validation. So let me go one step further because I want you to see this validation being also seen on the server side inside of Entity Framework. And what I'll do is I'll replace the MVC validation with a simple try-catch statement. So if it works, I'll get redirected to the index. If it doesn't work, I'll get stuck on my create page. I'm going to put a breakpoint right there, and we'll run this one last time. Okay, so the MVC validation did not capture the problem. But there was a problem in Save Changes. Not only did Entity Framework detect the problem and cause MVC to throw us back to the Create page, notice that I'm still getting the message the name field is required. So what happened is that Entity Framework's validation actually returned a validation result that MVC recognized was able to read and use when displaying on the client side. So that's a really interesting integration that Entity Framework 4.1 has with the client-side validation that MVC provides and other client-side applications such as dynamic data. They use the same type of validation result, so they're able to share that information, and this client-side application is able to take advantage of that. Even though the validation did not happen inside of MVC, the validation was done by Entity Framework. So I'm not going to spend a lot more time talking about validation here. I'm going to do a whole different module on it, but I just wanted you to see how it plays in with the data annotations, and you'll see that repeatedly. I just won't stop and focus on it as much. And finally, I should show you that when I do have proper information in there, that Entity Framework recognized everything was the way it should be, and it let me go ahead and save changes, and I came back to the index, and I can see the new Twitter alias there also.